she would later say. Fives are that the colors there don't exist on Earth. Not metaphorically, not poetically. She meant it as a clinical fact. Hues that human eyes were never designed to perceive. Seems light that didn't reflect off surfaces but seemed to radiate from within them. Fives, as if every petal, every rolling hill carried its own private sun. This is where she stood, a garden that no botanist could catalog, a sky that no painter could mix, and a feeling, so total, so absolute. Fives, that she would spend 30 years trying to describe it to people who could never fully understand. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before the garden, as if before the impossible light and the voice that spoke directly into the center of her being, Five Zakis, there was a hospital room. There were fluorescent lights, there was a needle, and there was a mistake that stopped her heart. We'll call her the young mother. She was 26 years old, healthy, full term. 9 months of anticipation leading to this single night in a delivery ward that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. She remembers being wheeled through a corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. The fluorescent lights above her sent buzzing and flickering like insects trapped behind glass. She wasn't afraid. Not yet. In her mind, she was running through the checklist a very expectant mother rehearses in those final hours. The overnight bag by the door. The tiny onesie on the kitchen counter was white with small yellow stars, the name she'd whispered to herself for months but hadn't told anyone. She was ready, or at least she believed she was ready. The truth is, nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen. Not the birth, not the pain, something else entirely. The delivery room was smaller than she expected. White tile walls. A single overhead lamp so bright it turned everything beneath it into a stage. She lay on the table and felt exposed. The kind of vulnerability that has nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with surrender. There were people around her, nurses, an anesthesiologist, the attending physician. Their voices blended into a low hum of professional routine, calm, practiced, almost bored. She remembers counting ceiling tiles, 12 across, 8 down, a small game to keep her mind still while her body repaired for the most significant moment of her life. Then the anesthesiologist approached. She felt the cold swab on her lower back. A small pinch, a pressure that spread slowly, surged like ice water pooling at the base of her spine. And for a moment, everything seemed perfectly fine. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The nurses moved with quiet efficiency. She would later describe this as the last, normal second of her life. And then, the beeping changed, not gradually, not gently. The rhythm that had been steady and predictable suddenly doubled, then tripled. The monitors screamed before any human voice did. She couldn't move. The anesthesia had already begun its work, pinning her to the table like a specimen under glass. But she could hear everything. Footsteps, frantic. Metal instruments clattering against steel trays. The sharp intake of breath from someone trained never to show fear. Some showing fear. And then a voice, a nurse's voice, stripped of all composure, cutting through the chaos like a blade. You killed her. 3 words aimed at the doctor, not whispered. And screamed. The kind of scream that comes not from anger, but from the absolute certainty that something irreversible has just happened. The young mother heard those words with perfect clarity. And in the fraction of a second it took F or their meaning to settle. The world went black, not dark, not dim, black. A totality of absence so complete it felt like being swallowed. No sound. No sensation, no pain. The frantic voice is gone. The alarm gone. The weight of her own body. Fives is gone. She wasn't unconscious. That's what she would insist upon for decades afterward. She wasn't dreaming. She wasn't hallucinating. She was somewhere else. And in that vast, impossible darkness, something began to glow. A warmth she had never known pressed against her awareness like sunlight through closed eyelids. And with it came a scent. Not hospital flowers, not perfume. Living flowers. Growing flowers. Flowers that seemed to carry music inside their fragrance. She was being pulled, gently, tenderly, toward a place that felt more real than anything she had ever touched with her own 2 hands. But here is what makes this story different from a NY near-death experience you may have heard before. It wasn't just her life hanging in the balance that night. There was a heartbeat inside of her. I sense a second life. Fifth Drew's a baby who had not yet taken a single breath of this world's air. And where she was being pulled, that child, Minjar could not follow. The delivery room was supposed to be a place of beginning. Birdsong, a sacred threshold where one life crosses into another, where the universe makes room for someone new. But on this particular night, in this particular hospital, the threshold would bend in a direction no one expected. Not toward life, not exactly toward death, but toward something in between. She had carried the weight of another soul inside her for 9 months. 9 months of whispered lullabies, of hands pressed against her belly in the dark, of imagining a face she had never seen but already loved more than anything on earth. And now, finally, it was time. The hallway lights buzzed overhead like tired sentinels as the nurses wheeled her toward the operating theater. She remembers the cold, the way the fluorescent glow made everything feel slightly unreal, as though the world itself was already beginning to thin. The anesthesiologist moved with routine confidence. She could hear the quiet choreography of medical professionals behind her, the clink of instruments, the murmur of checklists, the practiced efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times before. She told herself to breathe, that millions of women had been exactly where she was, that this was safe. The needle entered near her lower spine, a pinch, a pressure. And then, a strange warmth spreading outward like ink dropped into still water. The pain dulled, her muscles softened. She exhaled, and with that breath, she released weeks of accumulated fear. But something was wrong. She knew it before anyone told her. Not because she could see their faces, she couldn't, but because the room changed. The energy shifted, the steady rhythm of professional calm fractured. It started with a silence, since the kind of silence that doesn't mean peace. The kind that means everyone in the room has stopped breathing at the same time. Then the monitors screamed. Not beeped, not chimed, screamed. A shrill, relentless wail that cut through the sterile air like a blade through cloth. Numbers plummeted. Lines that had been steady and rhythmic collapsed into chaos. And then, rising above the electronic shrieking, above the sudden thunder of running footsteps and shouted orders, she heard it, a voice, a nurse's voice, as her stripped of all professionalism, raw and ragged and soaked in undeniable horror. You killed her. Yes, 3 words, aimed at the anesthesiologist, aimed at the man whose hands were now frozen in midair as though the universe had pressed pause on his entire existence. 3 words that entered her ears and detonated inside of her chest like a bomb wrapped in absolute certainty. Saidiu, a trained medical professional, had just declared out loud in a room full of witnesses that she was dead. Her heart tried to race but couldn't find the rhythm. Her lungs tried to expand but the air had turned to concrete. She felt her body becoming foreign to her. A thing she was wearing rather than a thing she was. The sounds of the room began to stretch and distort as if someone were pulling reality apart like taffy. The alarm tones bent into frequencies she had never heard before. The fluorescent lights above her seemed to pulse once, twice, as rhyme, and then they started to dim. Not flicker, not shut off, dim, as though the electricity powering them was being slowly, deliberately drained from the room, as though something or someone was pulling the plug on the physical world itself. She tried to call out for her baby, tried to form the words, tried to push sound through a throat that no longer obeyed her. But language had already left her, thought was leaving next. She could feel it, the slow, terrifying unraveling of everything she understood herself to be. Her name, her memories, her fears, all of it, loosening, peeling away like old paint from a forgotten wall. The last thing she registered was the so-und of the heart monitor. 0 zone, that final, unbroken tone, the flat line, that single, merciless note that meant the machine had given up trying to find a rhythm inside her chest. Because there was no rhythm left to find. And then, darkness. Not the darkness of sleep. Not the darkness of closing your eyes. This was the darkness of absence. The darkness that exists before a universe is born. Complete. Absolute. Without dimension, without temperature, without time. Second, she wasn't falling through it. She wasn't floating in it. She simply was it. She and the void were the same substance, the same silence, the same infinite nothing. Her body lay on that operating table, surrounded by panic and desperate hands and the mechanical violence of emergency resuscitation. But she was already somewhere else, somewhere the alarms couldn't reach, somewhere her dying was no longer a crisis, but a doorway that was about to open onto something she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe. 5,000 what waited on the other side was not what anyone, not the doctors, not the theologians, not even she herself, could have ever predicted. The anesthesiologist stepped forward. In any delivery room, this moment is routine, a standard regional block, a careful injection designed to numb the body while the mind stays awake, stays present, stays anchored to the miracle about to unfold. But in this room, on this night, routine was about to become catastrophe. The young mother lay on the surgical table, her belly swollen with 9 months of anticipation, her fingers gripping the side rail so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She could feel the cold swab of antiseptic on her lower back. She could hear the quiet, professional murmur of the attending nurse confirming dosages. And she told herself what every mother tells herself in that final stretch of labor. Faz, it's almost over, just breathe. Your baby is almost here. The needle went in, and something went wrong. She felt it before anyone said a word. A wave of cold spreading through her chest like ice water flooding a sealed chamber. Not numbness, not the expected tingling descent of anesthesia moving through her lower body. This was something else entirely. This was systemic. This was total. Her lips began to tingle. Her vision blurred at the edges, the overhead surgical light smearing into a shapeless white disc. And then, the monitors betrayed what the medical team hadn't yet spoken aloud. A sharp, unbroken tone sliced through the room. The kind of sound that transforms trained professionals into something more primal. Something desperate. The heart rate monitor, which seconds ago had been tracking 2 lives, was now screaming that one of them was failing. The young mother heard everything. She heard the clatter of a metal tray hitting the floor. She heard the rapid shuffle of footsteps converging around her. She heard the snap of gloves being pulled on with a violence that had nothing to do with procedure, and everything to do with panic. And then came the words. 5 Fs, and the words that no patient should ever hear while lying conscious on an operating table. The words that tore through the sterile air of that delivery room like a scalpel through silk. The nurse, her voice cracking with a terror she could not contain, turned to the attending physician and screamed, "Azuiz, you killed her." 3 words, unfiltered, unprofessional, and absolutely devastating. The young mother heard them with perfect, crystalline clarity, not muffled, not distant. Every syllable landed with the weight of a verdict. She wanted to scream back. She wanted to say, "I'm still here. I can hear you. I'm still breathing." But her mouth would not open. Her lungs would not expand. Her body, the body that had carried and protected a new life for 9 months, had simply stopped obeying her. The anesthetic had migrated. Medical literature would later describe what happened in precise clinical terms. A total spinal block, a catastrophic systemic reaction. But in that moment, there was no literature, there was no terminology. There was only a young mother, paralyzed on a table, listening to strangers try to save her life. 2, 3, the flat line held. 1 second, 2, 5. The chaos of the delivery room began to recede, as if someone were slowly turning down the volume on the entire world. The shouting, the footsteps, the metallic clanging of emergency instruments, all of it thinning, stretching, dissolving into a hum so faint it might have been silence itself. She could no longer feel the table beneath her. She could no longer feel the cold. She could no longer feel her body. Phaismanas, and here is where medicine ends and something else begins. The young mother did not experience a fade to black. She did not slip into unconsciousness the way one drifts into dreamless sleep. What she described, what she would carry with her for the rest of her life, was a departure, a lifting, as though the self she had always known was being gently separated from the vessel that had housed it. She rose, not physically, not metaphorically. She rose in a way that no language has ever been designed to articulate. The delivery room shrank beneath her, then vanished. 5s, or the monitor's scream, the nurse's accusation, the desperate hands pressing against her chest. All of it fell away like a stone dropped into deep water, and in its place, silence, total, infinite, alive. Not the silence of absence, not the silence of ending, but the silence of a threshold, the silence that exists in the space between one world and whatever lies beyond it. Her heart had stopped. Her lungs had emptied. Clinically, legally, measurably, the young mother was dead. 5s, but something was still aware. Something was still listening. And what it heard next would rewrite everything she believed about life, about death, and about the thin, fragile boundary between the two. But what waited for her on the other side of that silence was not darkness. It was not nothing. It was a place so vivid, so impossibly real, that life she'd left behind would feel like the dream. What she saw there, will stop you cold. The anesthesia was supposed to bring relief. Instead, it brought silence. One moment, the young mother was lying beneath the cold fluorescent wash of Teehee delivery room, feeling the sharp bite of the needle sliding into her spine. The next, something shifted, not in the room around her, but inside the very architecture of her awareness. The monitors changed their song first. That steady, rhythmic beeping, the mechanical lullaby of a heart doing its job, stuttered. Then it screamed. A rapid, chaotic cascade of tones that no expecting mother should ever have to hear in the final moments before meeting her child. She couldn't move. The anesthesia had low-aced her body into a prison of stillness. But her hearing was impossibly sharp. Every sound arrived with crystalline, almost supernatural clarity. The clatter of metal instruments being knocked aside. The urgent squeak of shoes pivoting on linoleum. And then, the voice. A nurse's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Fivez, you killed her. 3 words, directed at the physician. Spoken with the kind of horror that only erupts when P protocol shatters and something irreversible has begun. The young mother heard every syllable. And in the fraction of a second it took for those words to reach her consciousness, she felt the world begin to dissolve, not fade, not blur. Zeros and dissolve, as though reality itself were made of smoke, and someone had opened a window that led to nowhere. The beeping stretched into a single, elongated tone. The shouting pulled away like a tide retreating from shore, still audible but receding into some impossible distance. She wanted to scream. She wanted to reach for her belly, to feel the child still moving inside her. But her body was no longer answering, and then she was above. Not metaphorically, not in a dream. She was suspended near the ceiling of the delivery room, looking down at a scene that should have been impossible to witness. She could see herself. Just her own body draped in pale blue Surgic owl cloth, utterly motionless on the table below. Her swollen belly, her hands limp at her sides. Her face, slack, empty, absent of the Pearson who had inhabited it moments before. Not gruesome, just peaceful. Her body looked like an abandoned house. The lights were off. Nobody was home. Around that body, chaos reigned. She watched the medical team working with frantic precision. The doctor's hands trembling. The nurse who had screamed now pressing both palms against her own mouth, eyes wide with career-haunting terror. Another nurse rushing to a phone on the wall. Every detail was not just visible but felt. She could sense their fear. She could taste their panic. It radiated from them like heat from a furnace. But here is what disturbed her most. She didn't care. Not because she was cruel, not because she was indifferent, but because whatever consciousness now floated above the wreck cage of a medical emergency existed beyond the reach of fear. terror belonged to the room below, to the body below, and she was no longer part of either. The delivery room faded. The ceiling dissolved. The walls peeled away like pages from a burning book, and what replaced them was nothing, a void, immense, boundless. Darker than any darkness she had ever known, yet somehow not frightening. It was the darkness of a womb. The darkness that exists before the first word is spoken. The darkness that holds everything, because nothing has yet been born from it. She floated there, weightless, formless, untethered from every identity she had ever known. She was not a mother, not a wife, not a patient on a table with a failing heartbeat. She was simply awareness, pure infinite awareness suspended in a cathedral of silence. And within that silence, she began to feel something she had no language for. A presence, not a person, not a voice. Something far older and far larger than anything the human mind is designed to comprehend. It surrounded her the way the ocean surrounds a single drop of water, completely, intimately, without effort. She was not alone in the void. She had never been alone. And the realization hit her with the force of a truth as he had always known but never been allowed to remember. Then, from the farthest edge of that infinite darkness, color appeared. A single point of light, impossibly vivid, impossibly warm, expanding like the first dawn of creation itself. Something was waiting for her on the other side. Something she was never supposed to see while still alive. But what the young mother found beyond that light was not heaven as anyone had ever described it. It was something far stranger, far more beautiful, and far more dangerous to everything she had ever believed about the boundary between life and death. The monitor screamed. The nurse's voice cracked through sterile air like a gunshot. And then, everything stopped. Not slowly, not gently, but all at once. As if someone had reached behind the fabric of reality and simply turned it off. The young mother did not feel herself fall. She did not feel the table beneath her disappear, did not feel the oxygen mask lift from her face, did not feel the hands of the surgical team pressing frantically against her chest. She felt nothing, and that nothing was not emptiness. It was not cold. It was not frightening. It was the deepest silence she had ever known. She floated in a space between spaces, a threshold that belonged neither to the living nor to the dead. There was no sense of her body. No weight, no pain, no pressure. The agony of labor, the burning chemicals in her veins, the catastrophic failure of the anesthesia, all of it had been erased as though it had never existed. And in this boundless dark, she became aware of something extraordinary. She was still herself, not her body, not her name, not the woman on the operating table with a child fighting to be born. She was something older than all of that. Something that had always existed, and somehow, always would. Time did not pass here. It simply wasn't. And then, from the farthest edge of this infinite dark, a light appeared. It did not beckon. It did not call with words. It simply existed. And every fiber of her being understood that she was meant to move toward it. The light was not like sunlight. It was not like firelight or starlight or any illumination she had ever witnessed in 30 years of living. It was alive. It pulsed with intention. It radiated something she could only describe, years later, as pure, unconditional love. She moved forward, not by walking, not by flying, but by choosing. Each moment of desire to be closer brought her closer. as if the distance between her and that radiance was measured not in meters, but in willingness. And as she traveled deeper into this corridor of impossible light, something began to change. The edges of the tunnel softened. Colors she had never seen before, colors that do not exist in the visible spectrum of the human eye, began to bleed through. Shades that had no name, hues that carried emotion within them, as though color itself could weep with joy. She would later say that no painter, no poet, no physicist could ever reproduce what she witnessed, because these were not colors meant for human eyes. They were colors meant for the soul. And then, the tunnel ended. She stepped through, and the other side opened. The first thing she felt was the grass beneath feet she did not technically have. It was cool and impossibly soft, each blade alive with a gentle luminescence, as though the earth itself was breathing light. She looked down and saw wildflowers surrounding her in every direction. But these were not flowers as she had ever known them. Their petals held colors that made her weep simply by looking at them. Not from sadness, from recognition, as if some forgotten part of her had always known these colors existed and had spent an entire lifetime grieving their absence. Rolling hills stretched before her, covered in trees whose leaves shimmered with an inner glow. There was no sun in the sky, yet everything was illuminated. Light came from within every living thing, from the soil, from the petals, from the air itself. It was as if this place did not need a source of light, because this place was light. And then she heard it, birdsong, but not the scattered random calls of earthly birds. This was structured, intentional, each note woven into the next with a precision that suggested intelligence, composition, design. A melody so complex and so heartbreakingly beautiful that it seemed to carry the weight of every lullaby ever sung to every child who had ever lived. She stood in this impossible garden, and for the first time in her existence, she understood what peace truly meant. Not the absence of conflict, not the quiet after a storm, but a presence, a living, breathing, all-encompassing presence that held her the way a mother holds a newborn, completely, without condition, without end. The pain was gone. The fear was gone. The doubt, the exhaustion, the years of quiet desperation that had accumulated like dust on the shelves of her heart. All of it dissolved. She was home. She had always been home. She had simply forgotten. And somewhere in this sacred stillness, she became aware that she was not alone. A figure stood among the flowers on the nearest hillside, familiar, impossible, waiting. But who was waiting for her on that hill? And what would the voice she heard next ask her to sacrifice? And then there was light, not the harsh fluorescent light of the delivery room, not the cold blue flicker of medical monitors. This was something else entirely, something that should not exist, yet felt more real than anything she had ever known. The young mother opened her awareness and found herself standing at the edge of a world that defied every law of physics she had ever understood. Beneath her feet, grass stretched in every direction. But this was not the grass of any earthly meadow. Each blade pulsed with its own internal luminescence, as though leafy itself had been distilled into pigment and woven into the soil. The green was deeper than emerald, richer than jade, a color that carried weight, that hummed with a frequency she could feel rising up through her entire being. She was standing in a park, a landscape, a realm, and every square inch of it was alive. Rolling hills rose and fell in gentle waves before her, their contours soft and ancient, as though sculpted by a hand that understood beauty at its most fundamental level. Upon those hills, flowers bloomed in sea olives she had no name for. Sabiri, how do you describe a color that doesn't exist on Earth? A shade that falls somewhere between violet and gold, yet is neither. A hue her human eyes had never been equipped to process, yet here, she perceived it effortlessly, as though her consciousness had been upgraded, as though the limitations of biology had been stripped away, and she was finally seeing the world as it was truly meant to be seen. The flowers didn't just sit in the soil, they radiated. Each petal glowed from within, pulsing softly, rhythmically, almost like breathing. And the colors were not static, they shifted, they evolved, One blossom would begin as the deepest crimson, then slowly migrate through shades of amber and rose, settling into a luminous white that seemed to contain every color simultaneously. It was not a garden, it was a symphony, painted in pigments that the human spectrum could never hold. Trees rose around her, immense, majestic. Their trunks were smooth and luminous, as if carved from pearl and lit from within by some gentle internal fire. The bark shimmered with faint iridescence, shifting between silver and the palest gold, and their canopies stretched overhead like cathedral ceilings, branches interlocking in patterns so intricate, so mathematically perfect, that they looked designed. Not grown, designed. Every leaf caught the light and transformed it. They didn't merely reflect illumination, they refined it, made it kinder, softer, more intentional. And through those branches, she heard summit hing that brought her to absolute stillness. Birdsong, steer, not the scattered chirping of sparrows in a suburban backyard. This was composed. Each note landed precisely where it was meant to land, weaving with the calls of other birds she could not see, forming a melody so achingly beautiful that it seemed to bypass her ears entirely and pour directly into the center of her chest. Music that spoke a language older than words, a language her soul recognized, even though her mind had never learned it. She stopped walking and simply listened. Absurd tears that did not feel like tears moved through her awareness. Not sadness, not even joy exactly, something far more ancient, something closer to recognition, as if every note was singing a truth she had always known, but had somehow forgotten the moment she was born. And then there was the air itself. She breathed in, and realized that breathing here was not a biological function, it was an act of communion. The air was thick with something she could only describe as love. Not the romantic love of greeting cards and cinema, not the conditional love of human relationships, with its negotiations and its quiet disappointments. This was total, absolute, unconditional in a way that the human heart is simply not built to sustain. It moved through her like warm water through silk. It filled the spaces between her thoughts, the gaps between her memories, the cracks in her identity that a lifetime of pain had carved into her spirit. And it sealed them, gently, completely, without asking permission. She understood in that moment that this placed you as not a hallucination conjured by a dying brain. Fives. This place was more real than the hospital bed she had left behind. The delivery room, the anesthesia, the SC reaming monitors, those were the dream. This was the waking. The young mother stood in that impossible landscape, bathed in colors that had no nam-e, wrapped in a melody that had no end, breathing air made of pure, distilled love. And she felt, for the first time in her entire existence, a Sirah was complete. She was home. Every breath she had ever taken, every heartbeat, a very moment of suffering and joy had been a road, leading to this exact place. The darkness did not last. It shattered, not violently, but the way dawn shatters night, slowly, inevitably, with a warmth that felt older than the universe itself. And where there had been nothing, where the screaming monitors and the cold floor-scent panic of the delivery room had consumed everything she was, there was now this, a garden. But calling it a garden is like calling the ocean a puddle. The young mother stood in a landscape that defied every color her human eyes had ever processed. Green so deep they vibrated with life, violets that hummed against the air like tuning forks, and woven between the familiar hues, colors she had never seen before. Colors that do not exist on Earth. Colors for which no human language has ever invented a name. Rolling hills stretched endlessly beneath a sky that seemed to breathe. Enormous trees stood like ancient sentinels, their branches cascading with blossomus that released tiny sparks of golden light each time the wind passed through them. And the flowers. Every single petal appeared aware of her presence, turning gently, as though she had been expected here for a very long time. She was not walking. She was simply arriving, moving without effort as birdsong filled the air. But this was not the scattered chirping of earthly birds. This was a melody. Fives, a celestial composition, as if every winged creature in this realm was singing a single unified hymn in perfect harmony. And beneath it all, peace, a peace so total that she realized she had never truly known the word before this moment. But she was about to discover that this paradise was not empty. She saw her before her mind could form the thought. Standing among the impossible flowers, bathed in a ligeti that seemed to emanate from within her own form, was a figure she had buried 3 years ago, her grandmother. Not the frail woman who had faded in that hospital bed. Not the hollowed, diminished version that illness had left behind. This was her grandmother, restored, radiant, whole in a way that transcended physical wholeness. She stood with a quiet dignity woven from starlight, and around her, luminous beings moved through the air. Angels. There is no other word. Figures of pure light, vast and gentle, their forms shifting like flames frozen in mid-dance, circling slowly through the garden sky. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their presence communicated something her conscious mind could barely contain. A love so immense it pressed against the boundaries of her being like water against glass. Her grandmother smiled, and in that smile was every bedtime story, every whispered prayer, every kitchen table conversation that had quietly shaped the woman she had become. She wanted to run to her. She wanted to stay forever and never return to a world that suddenly seemed unbearably dim. And then, the voice. It did not come from above. It did not come from around her. It came from within everything. A voice, clear, gentle, and immeasurably vast, spoke directly into the center of her awareness. Not into her ears, into her soul. And it asked a question so simple that it shattered her entirely. Do you wish to stay, or do you wish to return? The question carried no judgment, no pressure. Only a love so complete that she understood whatever she chose. She would be held. She would be honored. She would be enough. And her answer came immediately. I want to stay. Bitching, the words rose from a place deeper than thought. She wanted this peace, this beauty, this reunion with a woman she had mourned every single day. She wanted to remain in this garden where colors Sanji and the air itself was made of unconditional love. She wanted to stay, and she meant it with every particle of her being. But her grandmother stepped forward. Circus and the look on that radiant Angel SS face shifted. Still love, still warmth. But beneath it now, something urgent. Something that carried the weight of a truth the young mother had been trying not to remember. Her grandmother did not speak with words. She spoke with knowing, a transmission of pure understanding that bypassed language entirely. And what she communicated was this. There is a child. As I is your child, born only moments ago into a world that is right now, screaming for you to come back. The paradise around her flickered, just for an instant, and through the crack in eternity, she heard it, faint, impossibly distant, but unmistakable. A newborn's cry. Her baby was alive, her baby was breathing, and her baby was alone. The most beautiful place in existence suddenly became the most painful, because now she understood the true nature of the question. It was never about choosing between life and death. It was about choosing between paradise and sacrifice. Fibo. And what happened next, the moment she made her decision, will change everything she believed about the boundary between this world and whatever waits beyond it. And then, everything stopped. The birdsong ceased. The celestial melody that had been weaving through the air like a living ribbon fell silent. The angels circling above became motionless, their wings frozen mid-ARC as though the entire realm had drawn in a single collective breath. The young mother stood in that meadow of impossible colors, and she felt it before she heard it. A presence, not beside her, not above her, but within every atom of reality itself. As though the ground beneath her feet, the light pouring through the sky, the flowers bending toward her, all of it was one singular consciousness, turning its full attention toward her. She would later describe this moment as the most terrifying and beautiful thing she had ever experienced. Not terrifying because it threatened harm, terrifying because she understood in an instant that she was completely and utterly known. Every thought she had ever harbored, every secret she had buried, every act of quiet kindness and every moment of hidden shame, all of it was visible, all of it was seen, and none of it was judged. And then, the voice came, not from the sky, not from behind her. It arrived inside her consciousness, gentle, impossibly intimate, as though someone had spoken directly into the core of who she was. One question, clear as crystal, warm as sunlight on a child's face. Do you want to stay? Or do you want to go back? 7 words. That was all. But within those 7 words, she understood something the hat would reshape every single day of her remaining life. The voice already knew her answer. It had always known. The question was not asked for information, it was asked as an act of love, because embedded in that question was the most radical revelation she had ever encountered. She had a choice. The creator of this place, of the colors that shouldn't exist, of the melody that healed every wound, of the grandmother who stood smiling nearby. This infinite intelligence was asking permission, not commanding, not deciding for her, asking. The deepest revelation of her entire experience, the truth that would burn inside her chest for decades to come. The message was this: love is not a feeling G. Love is not a reward for good behavior. Love is not something you earn at the end of a righteous life, waiting behind golden gates for those who followed the right rules, prayed the right prayers, or believed the right doctrine. Love is the very fabric of existence. It is what the trees are made of. It is what holds atoms together. It is the reason light travels across billions of miles of empty space just to touch the surface of a human face. Love is not something God does. Love is something God is. And here, standing in that meadow with tears she didn't know she could cry, the young mother understood the second half of the revelation, the part that shattered her completely. If love is the fundamental architecture of all reality, then she had never, for a single moment of her life, been separated from it. Not during her loneliest nights, not during her deepest doubts, not during the moments she believed herself unworthy of anything good. She had been swimming in it the entire time and simply couldn't see it. And in that single act, she received the message. The way a fish cannot see water, the way a child sleeping in a mother's arms cannot feel the gravity that holds them both to the earth. And the voice did not need to explain this with language. The knowledge arrived whole, like a completed puzzle pressed into her mind in a single instant. Every human being who had ever lived, who ever would live, was made of this same substance. Cruelty was not the opposite of love. Cruelty was the forgetting of love, and forgetting was temporary, always temporary. She fell to her knees, not because she was commanded to, not out of religious obligation. She fell because her legs simply could not hold the weight of what she now knew. She would later tell interviewers, her voice cracking each time, that the cruelest part of this revelation was not the knowledge itself. It was knowing she would have to carry it back into a world that operates on fear, back into rooms full of people who believe they are alone, back into a body that would dull this understanding with every passing year until it became just a memory. A strange, beautiful, impossible memory that no skeptic could take from her. She knelt there in that impossible garden, and she wept, not from sadness, from fullness, from the unbearable, crushing, magnificent weight of being loved, completely, without condition, without end. And it was in this exact moment, kneeling, overwhelmed, dissolved in gratitude, that her grandmother stepped forward, gently, quietly, with a soft expression that carried no urgency, and yet all the urgency in the world. The question still echoed through every atom of that impossible place. Stay or return. It wasn't spoken in language. It was felt, pressed into her consciousness like a thumbprint from the divine. And for one breathless, infinite moment, the young mother wanted nothing more than to remain. She wanted to dissolve into that meadow forever, to let the colors hold her, to let the birdsong replace every memory she had ever carried. Beswed, the love surrounding her was so complete, so devastatingly total, that the idea of leaving it felt like agreeing to drown. Why would anyone choose to go back to a body that had already failed her? But then her grandmother stepped forward, and the same woman who had greeted her at the edge of Paradise now stood before her with something new in her posture. Not joy, not welcome, something closer to sorrow. And without words, the grandmother placed a hand over her granddaughter's heart. The sensation was immediate. A tiny heartbeat, rapid, fragile, desperate, eerily alive, pulsed through her entire being. The baby, her baby, born into a world of screaming monitors and panicked voices, alone, motherless on its very first breath. The young mother understood then what the question truly cost. Staying meant peace beyond comprehension, but it also meant her child would open its eyes, and she would not be there. As her grandmother's presence radiated a single devastating truth. You are needed on the other side more than you are needed here. She didn't walk back, she didn't drift. She was torn. The moment she chose her child, the meadow shattered. The birdsong collapsed into a single piercing frequency. The colors bled away like watercolors dissolving in rain. Her grandmother's face, the last thing she wanted to hold, grew distant, receding into a golden point of light that shrank and shrank until it was nothing. And then came the fall. It was not gentle. It was violent, total, and merciless. She plummeted through layers of reality, as though each crashing through floors of a burning building. Each layer stripped something away. The warmth vanished first, then the peace, then the love. One by one, the gifts of that sacred place we were ripped from her like bandages from a wound. And what replaced them was pain. Searing, electrical, suffocating pain. The kind of pain that belongs only to a body. Heavy, broken, and desperate. She slammed back into her own flesh like a passenger thrown through a windshield. Her lungs screamed for air they had forgotten how to take. Her chest convulsed. Every nerve ending fired at once, and the world came roaring back in fragments. Blinding surgical lights, the metallic taste of oxygen, voices overlapping in controlled panic. Someone was pressing on her chest. Someone was shouting numbers. The monitors were shrieking their mechanical alarm. And somewhere beyond the chaos, a newborn was crying. That sound, that single, trembling, miraculous cry, cut through every layer of agony like a blade of pure light. It was the reason she had agreed to leave paradise. It was the reason she had surrendered the most beautiful thing she had ever known. But what the young mother didn't yet realize was that the return would cost her far more than the pain of re-entry. Because once you have tasted the infinite, the finite becomes a kind of prison, and the grief of what she lost on the other side was only just beginning. Weeks passed. The hospital released her. The paperwork was signed. Her daughter, pink and warm and impossibly alive, slept in her arms during the car ride home. Life, as the world defines it, resumed. But something inside the young mother had not come back with her. Or perhaps something had come back that she had never carried before. The first morning after dying felt like being born into the wrong world. The young mother opened her eyes in that recovery room and immediately knew something fundamental inside her had been rewritten. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a frequency she had never noticed before. The air tasted metallic and thin, as though the atmosphere itself had been diluted compared to wherever she had just been. She turned her head and saw her newborn daughter sleeping in a bassinet beside the bed. And she wept, not from joy alone, but from the staggering weight of what she had sacrificed paradise to return to. Within days, the world revealed its poverty. She walked into her garden at home, a garden she had once loved, and felt nothing but quiet sorrow. The reds were dull, the greens were lifeless. Every color on earth now looked like a faded photocopy of the originals she had witnessed on those impossible hills. She tried to describe it to her husband. She told him there were colors in that place that don't exist here. Colors between colors. Shades the human eye was never designed to perceive. He listened, he nodded, but she could see in his expression the distance already forming between her experience and anyone else's ability to understand it. The birdsong outside her window, once so cheerful, now sounded like a broken recording of the celestial melody she had heard among the angels. Everything beautiful on earth had become a reminder of something more beautiful she had been forced to leave behind. But something else had returned with her, something she had not carried before. She began to sense things. When her daughter cried at night, the young mother didn't just hear the sound. She felt the need beneath it, as though emotions had become a language she could now read fluently. She knew when her daughter was hungry before the cry came. She knew when her husband was troubled before he spoke. It wasn't psychic power in the way movies portray it. It was deeper, quieter. It was as though the veil between people's inner worlds and the outer world had grown thinner for her. Empathy had become almost unbearable in its intensity. She could walk into a room full of strangers and feel the sadness radiating from someone across the hall like heat from a furnace. She didn't ask for this. She didn't want it. But it was hers now. A permanent consequence of having stood in the presence of unconditional love. and then returning to a world that runs on conditions. Years have passed since that delivery room. Her daughter grew. She learned to walk, to speak, to laugh in a way that sometimes, just sometimes, reminded her mother of the celestial music she once heard among those impossible trees. And every time that laughter echoed through the house, the young mother understood why her grandmother had told her to go back. The message she brought from the other side was not complicated. It was not a theological doctrine or a prophecy. It was devastatingly simple. Love is the only thing that is real. Everything else, every argument, every fear, every grudge, every accumulation of wealth or status, dissolves the moment you cross that threshold. The only currency that survives death is how deeply and how freely you loved while you were alive. She says she no longer fears dying. What she fears now is not living fully enough to honor the sacrifice she made when she chose to leave paradise. She fears wasting a single day of this borrowed life, this second chance granted in a moment of impossible choosing. And when people ask her if she's certain, if she truly believes what happened was real, she doesn't argue. She doesn't defend. She simply smiles and says, "The only people who doubt it are the ones who haven't been there yet." She came back. The young mother chose the chaos of a surgical room over the most perfect peace she had ever known. She chose pain over paradise. She chose sacrifice over bliss. And that single decision carries a question that now belongs to you. What would you have done if the voice of God whispered into your ear and asked whether you wanted to stay in a place where colors have no name and love has no condition, or return to a world of monitors and sirens and uncertainty? What would you choose? Take a breath before you answer, because the truthful answer is harder than it sounds. Most of us believe we would stay. Most of us, reading our own lives from the outside, would pick the garden, the birdsong, the air made of love. We would never volunteer for a body that aches at 3 in the morning, for bills that never stop arriving, for arguments with people we love about things that will not matter in a decade. And yet, when the moment arrived, the young mother chose the hard road. Not because paradise was an illusion, but because there was a cry she had not yet heard, a hand she had not yet held, a name she had whispered for months, that still belonged to someone waiting for her. This story is not just hers. Every single day, you are making the same choice, not between life and death, but between presence and absence, between truly being here and merely existing. Her grandmother reminded her of something she had forgotten, that there was a child waiting, that love is not only felt, it is given, that the purpose of coming back was never about comfort. It was about her calling, and you have a calling too. Maybe it is someone who needs you. Maybe it is something unfinished. Maybe it is a truth you have been avoiding, a life you have been afraid to fully live. The colors she saw in that celestial park, those impossible unnamed hues, perhaps they exist here too. Perhaps we have simply forgotten how to see them. Perhaps the garden is not somewhere you go after you die. Perhaps it is what the world looks like when you finally remember that love is the fabric of everything. The grass in your backyard, the face of the person sitting across from you at dinner tonight, the sound of your own child breathing in the next room. The young mother came back carrying a secret the rest of us are supposed to discover slowly, across a lifetime, that the veil between paradise and ordinary life is thinner than we think, and it parts whenever we choose to love without condition. She was asked one question in that meadow, 7 words that rearranged her entire existence. Tonight, the question belongs to you. What are you still doing here? Who is waiting for you to come home, even if you are already in the same room? Who needs to hear the thing you have been too afraid to say? Because you came back too. Every morning you wake up, you have quietly agreed to stay, and that agreement means something. It means there is still someone or something that needs you to be fully here, not distracted, not merely surviving, present. If this story moved something inside you, if it made you pause, even for a moment, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Subscribe to this channel, not for us, but for yourself, because every story we share here is a mirror, and the next one might reflect something you desperately need to see. Leave a comment below. Tell me honestly, if the voice had asked you that question, would you have stayed in the garden of impossible colors? Or would you have come back? And for whom?